Before the divorces, before the tell-all confessions, before the family came apart on camera, the Brown wives were selling something. Leggings, supplements, wellness products, various multi-level marketing ventures that for years ran quietly in the background of the show. And if you actually follow that thread, the story of what the Brown women were selling and why, it tells you more about the real economics and the real pressures of this family than almost anything that happened in the confessionals. Because the hustle wasn't a side note. It was survival. So tonight, I want to talk about the MLM years, the era when the sister wives were selling more than a lifestyle, and what that whole chapter reveals about who was really holding this family together financially. Let me start with what was actually happening, because a lot of viewers half noticed it without thinking much about it. Over the years, the Brown wives became involved in various direct sales and multi-level marketing businesses. Christine, famously, sold clothing through one of the big legging-based companies. Others got involved in wellness and supplement products. These weren't huge corporate careers. They were the kind of work-from-home, sell-to-your-network businesses that millions of people, especially women in tight-knit communities, turned to in that era. And the Brown wives, with their large social networks and their television platform, were natural fits for it. So for a stretch, selling these products was a real part of how the women of this family tried to generate income. Now, here's the first thing that thread reveals, and it's important. Why were the wives hustling these businesses in the first place? Because the family needed money. We've talked extensively on this channel about the financial pressures in the Brown household, the strain of supporting a huge family, the money disputes, the unequal distribution of resources. The MLM businesses fit right into that picture. They were a way for the wives to bring in income, to contribute, to try to shore up the finances of a family that was, by its own admission at times, financially stretched. So when you see the wives selling leggings and supplements, you're not just seeing a hobby, you're seeing the economic reality of the family playing out. These women were hustling because the family needed them to. And that points to a deeper truth we keep coming back to, which is who was actually carrying this family financially. Because look at the pattern. The wives worked, the wives hustled, the wives built businesses, sold products, generated income, did the unglamorous labor of keeping a household afloat. We've discussed Janelle's practical, work-oriented nature, Meri's bed and breakfast, Christine's clothing business. Over and over, it's the women doing the income-generating work. And that reframes the whole family. The image was of Kody as the head, the provider, the center. But the reality, increasingly visible through things like the MLM businesses, was of wives carrying enormous financial weight, each finding her own way to bring in money. The hustle reveals who the real workhorses of this family were, and it wasn't the patriarch. Let me be balanced here, because there are a couple of ways to read the MLM chapter, and they're both worth holding. One reading is empowering. These were entrepreneurial women, taking initiative, building their own income streams, refusing to be passive. The MLM businesses, in this light, are evidence of the wives' drive and self-reliance, the same qualities that later allowed several of them to thrive after leaving. The other reading is more sobering. MLMs are a notoriously difficult way to actually make money, with most participants earning little. And the fact that the wives turned to them can be read as a sign of financial desperation, of women stuck hustling hard for uncertain returns because the family's economics demanded it. The truth is probably both. The businesses reflected both genuine entrepreneurial drive and real financial pressure, empowerment and desperation, tangled together. I want to talk about the relationship between the hustle and the image, because this is where it gets really interesting. Sister wives sold an image. A wholesome, loving, functional plural family. And behind that image, the wives were often hustling to make ends meet. There's a tension there worth sitting with. The polished family on screen and the financial scramble behind it weren't the same thing. The MLM businesses are a window into the gap between the image and the reality. On camera, a unified, comfortable family. Off camera, or in the background, women selling products to their networks to help keep that family financially afloat. The hustle is the reality that the image was, to some degree, papering over. And that gap, between the marketed family and the hustling reality, is one of the most honest things the show inadvertently revealed. Let me address the MLM model itself for a moment, because it actually rhymes with the family's whole structure in a way I find fascinating. Multi-level marketing is built on the idea of a network, of recruiting others, of a structure where those at the top benefit from the labor of those below. And there's an almost poetic parallel to a family structure where, as we've discussed, the labor and resources of several wives seem to flow toward benefiting the center. I'm not pushing that comparison too hard, but it's worth noticing. These were women operating inside a hierarchical family structure who also turned to a hierarchical business model. In both cases, the people doing the most work weren't necessarily the ones reaping the most reward. The MLM years, in that sense, almost mirror the family dynamics. Hard work flowing upward, uncertain returns flowing back. Now, let me give the wives real credit, because whatever the difficulties of the MLM model, what these women were demonstrating was hustle, initiative, and a refusal to be financially helpless. And that quality turned out to be enormously important, because look at what happened after the marriages ended. The wives who left didn't collapse into financial ruin. They had skills. They had experience generating their own income. They had the entrepreneurial muscle they'd been building all those years. Christine had her business experience. Meri had her bed and breakfast. These women had spent years learning how to make money on their own, and when they needed to stand on their own feet, they could. So the MLM years, difficult as they may have been, were also a kind of training ground. The wives were building the self-reliance that would later set them free. There's something genuinely poignant in that when you think about it. The very hustle that may have been born of financial pressure inside the marriage became the foundation of independence outside it. The skills these women developed selling products and building small businesses were the skills that, later, let them imagine a life apart from Kody and actually pull it off. So the MLM years weren't just about leggings and supplements. They were about women quietly developing the capacity to support themselves, which is the single most important prerequisite for being able to leave a situation that isn't serving you. The hustle that the family's economics demanded turned out to be the very thing that gave the wives the freedom to walk away. There's a real irony and a real beauty in that. Let me zoom out to what the MLM chapter tells us about this family's whole economic story, because it ties together so much. The picture that emerges across the mansion money, the Coyote Pass payouts, and now the MLM hustle is consistent. The wives worked, contributed, sacrificed, and hustled, often without reaping proportional rewards, while the resources of the family seem to consistently favor certain people over others. The MLM years are one more data point in that larger pattern. They show women laboring to support a family inside a structure that, by many accounts, didn't reward their labor fairly. Follow the money in this family through every chapter, and you keep arriving at the same conclusion. The wives gave, and the structure took. And the gap between their effort and their reward is the quiet financial through line of the entire show. So when I step back and look at the MLM years, here's what I see. I see women hustling, selling, building businesses, because the family needed income, and they were the ones who provided it. I see the gap between the polished family image and the financial scramble behind it. I see both empowerment and desperation tangled together in the same chapter. And I see, most importantly, women quietly building the self-reliance that would eventually set them free. The leggings and the supplements weren't the point. The point was that these women learned how to make their own way in the world, and that hard-won capability is exactly what let so many of them build better lives once they finally left. The hustle was survival, and in the end, it was also liberation. Let me give you the cultural context, because the Brown wives weren't doing anything unusual for their world, and that's part of what makes it so revealing. In the years these businesses peaked, multi-level marketing companies selling clothing, makeup, supplements, essential oils exploded in popularity, especially among women in tight-knit religious and family-centered communities. These companies marketed themselves specifically to stay-at-home mothers and women in traditional family structures, pitching a dream of flexible income you could earn from home without sacrificing your family role. For women in exactly the Brown wives situation, large families, traditional values, limited conventional career paths, the pitch was tailor-made. So when the Brown wives got involved, they were riding a massive cultural wave that swept up millions of women just like them. They weren't outliers. They were the target demographic. And that's worth sitting with, because it locates the Brown family inside a much bigger story about women and money in a particular kind of community. The same structures that often limited these women's conventional economic options, large families, traditional gender roles, made the work-from-home MLM dream especially appealing. It promised income without requiring them to step outside the family role. But here's the hard truth that's become widely understood about these companies. The vast majority of people who join them don't make meaningful money. The model tends to reward the small number at the top, while most participants earn little or even lose money on inventory and fees. So the dream that was marketed to women like the Brown wives was, for most, very difficult to actually realize. The promise was flexible prosperity. The reality, for most participants, was a lot of hustle for modest or negative returns. I don't say that to mock anyone who participated, including the Brown wives. I say it because it adds a layer of poignancy. These women were working hard, often selling to their own friends and networks, chasing a dream of financial contribution and independence inside a business model that was statistically stacked against them. That's not a knock on their effort or their intelligence. It's a comment on the system they, like millions of others, got drawn into. And it deepens the picture of the Brown wives as women hustling hard under financial pressure, pouring real energy into ventures that, for most people, didn't pay off the way the marketing promised. The effort was real. The deck was just not in their favor. That's a sympathetic story, not a mocking one. Let me talk about the network dimension, because it's where the MLM hustle and the family's public life intersected in an uncomfortable way. Multi-level marketing runs on selling to and recruiting from your personal network. Your friends, your family, your community, and in the Brown wives' case, potentially their audience. When you're a public figure with a following, that audience becomes a potential customer base. There's something a little uncomfortable about the blurring there, where the parasocial relationship with fans can become a sales channel. I'm not accusing anyone of anything improper. I'm noting that for public figures, the line between sharing your life and selling to the people watching your life can get blurry. And the MLM era is where that blurriness showed up for this family. The audience that tuned in for the story could also become the market for the products. And we shouldn't leave Kody out of the economic picture, because the hustle wasn't only the wives. Kody pursued his own ventures over the years too, various business ideas and efforts to generate income for the family. So it's not as if the wives were hustling while Kody did nothing. But here's the distinction that matters. The pattern that emerges across the whole show is of the wives consistently being the steady, practical income generators, the ones doing the persistent, unglamorous work of bringing money in, while the overall financial picture of the family remained strained and the resources flowed unevenly. So even acknowledging Kody's efforts, the through line holds. The wives were the financial workhorses, and the MLM era is one of the clearest illustrations of that dynamic in action. Now watch what happened to these women's economic lives after the marriages ended, because it's the most telling part. The wives who left didn't just survive financially, several of them pivoted into more legitimate, more sustainable ventures and platforms. Christine built a real brand and business profile, leveraging her popularity into genuine opportunities, and now has a memoir on the way. Meri has her bed and breakfast and her own ventures. The entrepreneurial energy that, during the marriage, got funneled into difficult MLM hustles got redirected after the marriage into building real, self-owned success. That progression is significant. It suggests that the constraint during the marriage wasn't a lack of drive or ability on the wives' part. They clearly had both. The constraint may have been the structure itself, which channeled their entrepreneurial energy into survival mode hustling rather than letting it build into something bigger. Freed from that structure, the same energy produced real results. That progression also reframes the gender dynamics of the whole family in a pointed way. For years, the public image positioned Kody as the head and provider, but trace the actual economic labor, the MLM hustle, the side businesses, the persistent income generation, and it's overwhelmingly the women's story. These were women carrying real financial weight inside a structure that publicly centered a man. And when that structure dissolved, the women's economic capability didn't dissolve with it. It flourished because it had been theirs all along. The MLM years, seen in that light, are a quiet preview of the post-divorce reality. The wives were always the economic engines. The marriage just obscured it. Once the marriage was gone, what had been true underneath the whole time became visible on the surface. The providers, it turned out, had been the wives. I think there's a broader lesson in the MLM chapter that resonates well beyond this family, and it's about the economic situations we get drawn into and how they shape our options. So many people, especially women in particular kinds of communities, find themselves channeling real talent and real effort into systems that don't reward them fairly, whether that's a difficult business model or a family structure that takes more than it gives. And the path to freedom, so often, runs through building genuine, independent capability, the kind that's actually yours. The Brown wives' journey from MLM hustle inside the marriage to real independence outside it is a vivid example of that path. The hustle taught them they could generate income. Leaving let them finally do it on their own terms. The skills were always theirs. They just needed the freedom to use them for themselves. So the MLM years, which could easily be dismissed as a forgettable footnote, leggings and supplements between the bigger dramas, actually contain the whole economic story of this family in miniature. Women hustling under pressure, effort flowing into a system stacked against them, a gap between the marketed image and the financial reality. And underneath it all, women quietly built the capability that would eventually carry them to freedom. It's all there, in the unglamorous story of what the sister wives were selling. They were selling products, sure, but what they were really doing was developing the self-reliance that the whole rest of their story would be built on. And that makes the MLM years not a footnote at all, but one of the most quietly important chapters in understanding how these women became who they are today. And there's a final irony worth savoring. The MLM companies sold these women a dream of independence that, for most participants, never quite materialized through the products themselves. But the dream came true anyway, just not in the way the sales pitch promised. The real independence didn't come from the leggings or the supplements. It came from everything the hustle taught them about their own capability, their own work ethic, their own refusal to be financially helpless. The product was never going to set them free, but the person they became while selling it, the resourceful, self-reliant woman the hustle forged, absolutely did. In the end, the Brown wives got the independence the MLMs advertised. They just had to leave the marriage, not move more inventory, to finally claim it. And that may be the truest thing the whole MLM era has to teach us about this remarkable group of women. So I'll turn it over to you, because I'm curious where you land. Do you see the wives' MLM businesses mainly as a sign of admirable entrepreneurial drive, or mainly as a sign of the financial pressure they were under? And here's the bigger question for the comments. When you follow the money across this entire family, do you agree that the wives were consistently the ones carrying the financial weight? Tell me where you land, because I read every comment and the money side of this family always sparks the sharpest discussions. If you want me to do a full Follow the Money series tracing every financial thread of this family, from the businesses to the houses to the land, let me know, and I'll build it out. And if you appreciate that we look at the unglamorous economic realities behind the on-screen image, then do me a favor and subscribe, because that kind of deeper analysis is exactly what we do here, and there's so much more of this family's real story still to uncover.